Okay, there's a lot of topics I want to cover with Into the Pit because I think it's the game with some of the most interesting theorizing potential in a while. I mean, Ruin and Help Wanted 2 had some interesting stuff to speculate about, and Security Breach was a whole mess of things to talk about. But there's a lot of interesting specifics I want to cover with this game. But of course, a question that a lot of people are already asking, and I know people are going to ask if I just jump in without explaining this, is where do I think this fits in the game's continuity? And on that same topic, does this game confirm Stitchline games or other related theories, such as Frights games? Well, see, no matter how you slice Andrew's Agonized Pizza, I think there are several differences and additions between the books and games, even including this adaptation. That said, I do think the books are more or less in the game line continuity, kinda. We'll get into this because the three main minigames we get in this game that matter do all have subtle, small either additions or changes to the original story that weren't really possible to figure out or even assume with the original version, or just outright different. One of the examples of an addition is with Fetch. In the original stories, there's literally no implication anywhere that Andrew was killed by Fetch, which isn't what I think happens in this minigame per se. I'm just saying, if that was what we were meant to get out of this, that would be hugely different. In fact, that kind of completely breaks how his entire hatred of Afton and connection to Afton works, which is why I think this is supposed to be a follow-up to the end of the story. See, at the end of the original story, the phrase "see you," as in "I'll see you," is said by Fetch to Greg, the main character. We don't know what happens to Greg after this message happens. However, we do know he's near Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, which is where he meets Fetch for the first time, and Fetch is in the prize counter. And in Into the Pit, we see that pizzeria with Greg, going around collecting balloons in various rooms, notably all rooms that children would be in, and 6 balloons luring them back to that room, much like Pit Trap does in the base game. However, as bizarre and somewhat aggressive as Fetch can be, he never attacked Greg personally in the original story, which would make this mauling at the end fascinating on a technical level. It's not like some of the agony-infected things aren't aggressive, it's just interesting to see this happen. It's also interesting that this is when the phrase "see you" is said. Now, it could just be that they had to put this in the minigame so people who didn't read the books could understand that the teaser at the end of the 3-star ending, which says "see you," was foreshadowing Fetch as the next game, or this could be implying that this is when the phrase is said in the updated version of the story. Either way, this is definitely an addition to whatever the context of Fetch was, whether this be a flashback with Andrew or a follow-up to whatever happens at the end of the original short story. The next story that gets adapted into a minigame is To Be Beautiful. It follows a girl named Sarah who finds an animatronic named Eleanor who looks suspiciously like Baby but doesn't ever seem to be directly Baby in any of the stories, and it looks even more like Baby in this minigame, but once again doesn't seem to be Baby unless we get this confirmed later in the games. Whatever, Eleanor offers Sarah a single wish, and Sarah wishes to be beautiful. And this is where a change is made. In the original story, one of the first things Eleanor does is give Sarah the silver pendant. We later learn that the heart-shaped pendant has some magical properties because it is infused with or made entirely out of remnant. Night after night, Sarah wakes up and becomes more and more beautiful. However, at the very end, something goes wrong and she turns into a pile of trash. Eleanor then takes back the pendant and demonstrates some sort of implied shapeshifting ability. This is kind of what we see happen in the minigame, where night after night Eleanor slowly changes how Sarah looks, but the difference is we don't give her the pendant at first, it's the final item we give her. Even trying to stretch this as a metaphor, this is a definitive change in how the minigame is presented. The more accurate way to represent this would be we give her the pendant as the very first action, then make her beautiful, then take it back. In fact, in the minigame, it almost reads like giving her the pendant is what killed her. Whereas in A Tale from the Pizzaplex story, Frailty, which follows a different character who has a pendant, whose name I totally remember and didn't forget while writing the script, in her case, the pendant running out of remnant is what causes her to revert to trash, which has the opposite implication. Lastly, in this very Foxy Go-Go-Go-esque minigame, we have Millie. Millie is a girl who finds a Funtime Freddy animatronic and gets trapped inside of it. Funtime Freddy then continues to list all the ways she could be killed, such as dehydration, starvation, boiled alive, you get the picture. This is the one that's the most interesting to me because much like Fetch, it kind of gives us information we could have never assumed with the original story. In the original story, Funtime Freddy is never described as having a bonbon. Prior to Into the Pit, it was assumed that this was an indication that it was a separate model of Funtime Freddy or a separately produced unit of the character. Similar to how we have 2 different Funtime Foxies, but they both represent the same character in the Fazbear brand, but are not physically the same animatronic. So it wouldn't be that absurd to assume this was just a separately produced Funtime Freddy. Not to mention where it was located doesn't make much sense either. However, one of the key details we're shown in Into the Pit's version of events is the Bon Bon hand puppet, which is a jarring detail to include because it's not like they were doing this just to tell us it was Funtime Freddy. They could have just drawn Funtime Freddy himself. It's not like they couldn't handle large sprites or characters, and it's not like there's any other Freddy that's white and pink. They specifically made Bon Bon the detail to imply here. To me, there's kind of two interpretations of this detail, and both of them have strange implications that contradict how the original story played out. Both linking to the idea that this is not just a Funtime Freddy, but the Funtime Freddy, the one we saw in Sister Location, or one very similar to that one. The original story would just be in this hypothetical wrong or outdated and not representing Bon Bon there. Thus, the Into the Pit version would be trying to clarify that yes, Millie's Freddy did have a Bon Bon. Then we could take that an even step further, with implying that Millie is Bon Bon, or after dying and Count the Ways, possesses Bon Bon. I don't know if this is a change to the story, or this was something that Scott intended to be in the story and the writer didn't accurately represent. Regardless, we have Bon Bon be the final thing she interacts with, which is just bizarre. That shouldn't even be possible in the original story. It doesn't even chronologically make sense. Okay, upon some reflection, I have found something that could potentially explain this Bon Bon detail a smidge more. See, in Into the Pit, when you go to the mill, you can find two interesting options buried in the trash. There's something that looks a lot to me like a Bon Bon thrown away in the trash, as well as this white mask with a pink snout. It's particularly wide rather than thin like a Foxy snout, so I think this is a thrown away Funtime Freddy. We know that even the agonized objects can decay and rot over time. In fact, in the Stitch Wraith snares, we fetch break down over time and its battery get found and put into the Stitch Wraith. So it's possible that this is years after the events of Count the Ways and Funtime Freddy has broken down over time and collapsed in the mill, thus leaving its haunted parts buried there. This theoretically could be what happened to our hypothetical other Funtime Freddy if that's where we're going with the story. That or these are just the shells from Sister Location that have just been taken and thrown away elsewhere. All interesting stuff to consider, I just thought I'd point that out. Back to the original recording. But I think there's a relatively simple answer to these seeming discrepancies, or additions in some cases. The original stories I do genuinely think are just wrong or outdated, well, to an extent. In the anniversary edition of the Dawko interview, we got some interesting details about how FNaF was handled after Ultimate Custom Night. The biggest confirmation to me was that Security Breach in fact was made largely out of details that Steelwool weren't accurately representing, mainly because Scott did not tell them what all the details he wanted them to include meant, thus putting on them to figure out how to connect the pieces, thus meaning that Security Breach is almost like the Steelwool interpretation of lore rather than what was actually meant to be there. And this explains why some details were outright changed or removed, such as Cassidy being the name of the princess. That was removed right as people found it, and now we know that Steelwool was kind of just making stuff up based on clues they were given. Likewise, Burntrap was never even meant to move in the game at all. He had some sort of stationary, questionable existence that we weren't meant to fully understand, though in the final game, he is just the final boss. And if this was the approach Scott had for the mainline game entry, don't think it's unreasonable to assume that Fazbear Frights had a less extreme version of this happening. I say less extreme because according to Scott, he wrote a 10 to 15 page draft of every Fazbear Fright story that respective writers expanded upon and rewrote to fill out for time to be fully novella length. To put those numbers in perspective, that's roughly a 3 to 4 times expansion of what Scott originally wrote. And I think this is where a lot of our original oddities in the books came from. Now, they fare slightly better than Security Breach because there is an original written draft they are directly riffing on, but it means that they probably don't know a lot of the meaning that Scott had in mind for those stories, much like Steelwool. Thus, their expanded versions are going to be made out of a lot of assumptions, and also, likewise, a lot of things they just felt like writing in, or it seemed like a good idea at the time. To me, I think we can outright see this be fixed and adjusted in real time with the later half of Tales from the Pizzaplex. The first half of the series feels a lot more like Fazbear Frights, where it's a lot of stories that don't have 100% clear connections to the games, only some assumed points where they might overlap. Whereas starting with Bobby Dots, and especially with the book Bobby Dots Conclusion, a lot of the stories become much more explicit in their role in the continuity and where they connect with other characters. Given that the first 4 books were likely written before Security Breach came out, or largely had a lot of writing done before that happened, I wouldn't be surprised if they were caught up in a lot of the problems that base game had. Likewise, this could explain a lot of the oddities people have been arguing about in the Frights books for ages, and it might even explain why Scott was so coy about the continuity of the original book series. The answer might just not have been simple about how it worked at all. And I think Into the Pit, along with Fetch and any other games in the series, are going to be the sort of definitive, updated versions of those stories, adding in details Scott wanted there to be. For example, maybe Count the Ways was meant to be the origin to this kid we saw in the blueprints in Funtime Freddy, and directly explain how Bon Bon worked or was possessed, something that wasn't really elaborated on or explained very well in original sister location, or really ever. However, with the added details the writers filled in, it suddenly made that impossible and outright implied it was a different Funtime Freddy. And I wouldn't be surprised if certain plot elements like Eleanor's weird-ass reveal in the final epilogue were meant to be more cleverly foreshadowed throughout the stories or events. However, the writers didn't know that was where those stories were going, so it kind of feels out of left field. Though to sort of walk back to the actual Into the Game version events, implication to me that is the single most interesting addition is Golden Freddy not only being in Fetch's building, but actively being possessed. Now that's weird twofold. In Into the Pit's present day with Jeff, Golden Freddy is not in the building anymore. However, Fetch is supposed to be after FNaF 6, or at least would be based on the context clues we're given. Whereas Into the Pit's original story was supposed to be in 2020, or implied to be based on Oswald saying that the new Xenodrenalix movie was Xenodrenalix 2020, which when I first read it, I thought they were doing a 2001 A Space Odyssey kind of thing, where it was something that was yet to happen, like they weren't in 2020 yet, that was just a futuristic time. But then I realized they mentioned a ton of smartphones and stuff, so no, that wouldn't make much sense. That would be like 4 years in the future, or 10 years in the future, which is not typically when those numbers are picked. So it does definitely read in the original story like 2020 is the present day or near present day. However, unless FNaF 6 was actually before 2020 this whole time, Fetch should be after 2023. In fact, Fetch is directly after Man in Room 1280, or nearly after it in some reasonable time frame, and Man in Room 1280 is 2 years after the fire of FNaF 6, which would place the story at minimum in 2025 or later. That would mean, based on the short story logic, Into the Pit would have to be in 2025 or later, as Golden Freddy is no longer in Jeff's Pizza, but was in 1985, implying these two were between each other in events. That's something that's further suggested by Fetch's minigame because Fetch is in the Jeff's Pizza / 1985 locations layout, which in the context of the original story, it's still an abandoned and rotting Freddy's location, not Jeff's Pizza, which would mean it would have to not only be before the events of Into the Pit, but a reasonable amount of time for Jeff to buy up the location and start running it himself. And also, more importantly, the party room is unsealed and Fetch is in there, whereas it is definitely sealed in the present. So it has to be before Jeff's Pizza becomes Jeff Pizza and renovated and the room is sealed and all that. Speaking of Golden Freddy being there and being possessed based on the glowing white eyes, maybe I haven't accentuated that enough. What the frick a Faz flying I really see only two routes for this being Golden Freddy and actually possessed by a spirit or entity. One, it's Cassidy, and Cassidy is still around post-6 because this is in Fetch, which is after 6 in the original story, and if Golden Freddy is in Fetch, specifically at the end of Fetch, and is still possessed, you know, that means there's somehow a Golden Freddy after 6, which if Cassidy would imply happiest day does not happen to them, or their soul does not move on for whatever reason, or there is a new Golden Freddy running around that's in random old MCI locations for some reason. I know some people are arguing this is just to explain that Golden Freddy and Fetch are two separate characters, but why show one's possessed? Why not just have the destroyed remains of Golden Freddy on the floor or something? And I wouldn't even argue that's what this scene really says. To me, it just says Golden Freddy exists post-6, which, like I said, raises questions. Who is this Golden Freddy? If it's Cassidy, I guess that kind of confirms Molten MCI Alteress is true because the suit is still intact out here somewhere else, but also means Cassidy has some greater narrative purpose beyond being the vengeful spirit and also beyond moving on with the other MCI kids. Which makes me wonder if Bite Victim Receiver actually did happen, as in like everyone, including the Bite Victim, moved on except for Cassidy, and we still haven't seen their role in the story yet or something? The only other thing I could consider being a Golden Freddy character other than the fifth missing kid would be the one time there was a Fredbear Golden Freddy suit in The New Kid, one of the other Fazbear Fright short stories. But that one had nothing to do with Fetch concept or principle wise. Fetch is never noted as being in the building. But then again, we do have some unknown amount of writer errors, so who knows what's going on there. But even giving it Kelsey or some other character that appeared in that story what exactly is going on with it is still mysterious and strange. I guess there's also the Golden Freddy that was in FNaF AR, who's also a kind of mysterious unknown, and now I'm wondering if that's Cassidy and the Golden Freddy suit has just been accidentally dragged into the rental service, or if there's like a replica Golden Freddy going around that's like fueled by agony or something, and then like maybe Andrew's agony infected that Golden Freddy, making our second one rolling around, and that's what we're seeing in Fetch? Maybe? I don't know. It's such a weird inclusion. It's one of those things where sometimes you want to take the easy lore answer that would confirm previous theories and just run with it, but I really can't say for sure with this one. Oh, what about Stitch Wraith showing up in the game? I don't know how that works. That seems to go along with the idea with Fetch being before the events of this game, and Stitch Wraith has to be after Fetch, so, you know. In the original Stingers, the Stitch Wraith is very standoffish with people. I mean, humans are just kind of trouble for the Stitch Wraith in general, so it makes sense that he would avoid them when he can. He also doesn't want to hurt people, and the Stitch Wraith has, at multiple points, accidentally harmed people earlier in the stories. This lines up with how we see the Stitch Wraith in Into the Pit. It's just watching from the window and then leaves. It wants to help and keep an eye on the kid that's in danger, but can't really step in itself. More alarmingly, in the original Stingers, when Jake enters the ball pit to help people, such as Millie's trapped soul, he appears not as the Stitch Wraith, but himself in his prime, his young child self fully healthy. He just directly approaches Millie and offers help, which is the exact opposite of what we've seen Into the Pit, which I bring up because there's some theories that try to explain the events of this game as being entirely within the ball pit, as in even the real world / present is part of Oswald's memories or soul that are trapped in the ball pit still and just reliving the events, or hallucinating that the events ever even happened in the first place. He would just be another lost soul, similar as how Millie is trapped in the pit. And while that could explain some parts of the game and a fair amount of the seeming time travel without having literal time travel, and maybe even explain why Oswald draws the characters before going into the pit, I find this would make Jake's appearance as the Stitch Wraith in this game questionable or out of character or even contradictory to the mechanics the original stories had. So while I don't know for a fact if this is time travel, I think it has to be something that involves actual time manipulation, given that Oswald is consistently shown to be able to interact with physical objects in the past that have effects on the future, such as the paper plate pals, or Bonnie's guitar, which is previously in Jeff's Pizza, disappearing when you collect it in the past, or the rat you bring to the future, or being able to find items in the past that can repair arcade cabinets in the future, or Oswald's inventory being persistent in the future at all. So either you have to fully commit to it's all in the pit, or there has to be some level of real time manipulation going on there, which at simplest I think is something like the alternate dimension of the pit has an actual effect on 1985. And also, once again, going back through the video and some other footage I've recorded, it definitely seems like the game is implying this is Cassidy's Golden Freddy, or at least it's a Golden Freddy haunted from something in this location. As obviously has the glowing white eyes, which are pretty iconic to the Golden Freddy we know. In fact, I don't think the one in FNaF AR has the glowing white eyes, it just has pure black eyes with white shines on it. But maybe that's just a stylistic thing. But more importantly, you know, it's the same suit in the same position as it was in 1985, which is weird visual storytelling if this is a separate suit from the one that was in 1985. And if this is that same suit from 85, then, you know, it would be Cassidy's, assuming this isn't a third MCI / killing spree William went on, that happens to have the same design as the Golden Freddy we know and love. Not to mention, it's literally called Golden Freddy in the achievements. So once again, either there are two Golden Freddys now, or this is the one we've always known, which once again implies that Golden Freddy exists after FNaF 6, which is just so weird and interesting. But to get back to the overall point of the timeline, that would place Into the Pit in 2025 or 2026, and, you know, that's definitely not 2020. Unless the book has priority over the game version, which I don't know why it would, because when you add everything up, like Gabrielle's story being a little different in that her grandpa / uncle, the game says both, was a technician for the animatronics, that's never mentioned in the original story. Oswald saves kids trapped by Pit Trap, that never happens in the original story. The Stitch Wraith is somehow here. The main animatronics minus Foxy and Golden Freddy are active when it was only Pit Trap in the original story. Oswald doesn't go back and forth into the cursed kind of evil version of 1985 post the MCI with a question mark nearly as much as he does in the game. In fact, he only really goes back to it at the very end. This whole story arc of him looking for his dad in the pit isn't really as much a thing. Oswald's friend Ben from the original short story isn't at all mentioned in the game to my knowledge. And if every adapted game ends up being this noticeably different, I do think we're in some sort of new Stitchline story arc. And given the fact that this is a Scott who has gone through a security breach and supposedly learned from it, I'm going to assume this is the definitive version of events. If you were to try and apply this answer before we had Into the Pit, or the confirmation that security breach wasn't an accurate representation of the story Scott meant it to be, you have to explain like, yeah, events more or less similar to the books happened, but not really with some of the specific details, so it can be really hard to follow what's where and what's why, or outright make errors and unintentional contradictions that would make the timeline sort of impossible to follow or stick together. And that's a really hard thing to convey or explain without probably messing with the fandom a lot for their perception of this material. You know, up until this past month, Scott was completely silent about security breaches for representation of the story, so him being quiet about this also would kind of make sense. Like, we had 2 entire games that are apparently correcting the lore and pushing it in the right direction since the supposedly incorrect version of events came out. So the idea that he could be using Into the Pit the same way that he was using Ruin and Help Wanted 2 for security breach would make a lot of sense to me. For now, I think we do have to interpret how these things would play in the game line continuity. And that doesn't mean every timeline or thing I've talked about is fully debunked or out of the question. In fact, I think there's a really interesting interpretation of Cassidy this might open up that I do plan to write into a video itself. Overall, I have a lot of interesting videos I have in the pipeline and ideas I'm going with for how the series works, and I also have a video that kind of dissects how Pit Bonnie / Pit Trap works, because I do think I've got a pretty good answer to the exact mechanics of Pit Trap and why he works the way he does in that game. That's almost going to be more of a character analysis video than an actual theory video. I just wanted to get a sort of ground level basic overview video on the continuity and how I think it might work in the future, because understanding the rules of how I'm applying the book is going to be important. With all that said,